Herzlich willkommen zur 23.
So, a warm welcome to our 23rd Foreign Policy Conference of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. I'm Giorgio Franceschini, the spokesperson for Foreign and Security Policy. And now we are celebrating our third day, our third session, where we will talk about the global consequences of the war in Eastern Europe. On Monday, we kicked off our journey in Eastern Europe itself, where we talked to experts on the ground from the region as to what their perspective is, how they perceive the crisis on the ground. Yesterday, we broadened our view to a transatlantic format, to US Americans and Europeans. And today, we will raise the question of security in East Europe from a global perspective for second time. And I'm really glad that for this first initial talk, we were able to gain our co-president, Imre Scholz, who I'd like to ask to turn on the camera. Imre, since March, you are one of the new presidents of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and in summer we got together in order to think about how we will shape this foreign policy conference. Of course, the war in Ukraine moved all of us here in Europe, and we definitely wanted to include this issue in our foreign policy conference, but you wished for a very broad perspective and to go beyond the regional sphere and to gather information from the whole world. Maybe you can share with us why you think it is so important to have this global perspective on this regional war here in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, danke, Giorgio.
Thank you so much, Giorgio, for your introduction. Yeah, as you rightly said, the war takes place in Eastern Europe, but it does have its consequences on the whole world, on the world economy, on the food security and the energy supply, and then, of course, inflation and rising cost for living do play a part, but it does have an impact on multilateral order and the support of Ukraine in its resistance. This, of course, absorbs many resources, political capital, and this resource lacks for multilateral cooperation in other regions, and therefore they do have an impact on these other regions as well. And then I would say that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and the world's largest nuclear power, and if such a country invades another country, then of course all the remaining UN members have to ask themselves the question what the UN Charter is really worth, and maybe they ask themselves what we have to do in order to protect the UN Charter and its chapters. And the Kenyan ambassador will surely share some interesting thoughts about that. Yesterday, when we were talking about, or talking to Sergei Ladinska, he said that it is a global problem to protect the Ukraine, but that the EU did not accomplish to convince the whole world or the global south as such. And I think this shows the weakness of the multilateral order and the international humanitarian law. And this, of course, is a global interest that we have to treat as such. And so this is the reason why we wanted to include perspectives from the whole world here in the foundation. And with our network of offices abroad, we really try to achieve this 360-degree perspective and to combine those perspectives here from Europe with the others from Latin America, from Asia and Africa, and to get into this dialogue that is so important and will definitely be of benefit for our own foreign policy. And by that, we will understand a lot better how those countries directly affected perceive the war, and those who support the countries, the EU, the member states of the NATO, whom we are one country of, and then all the other countries that are affected by economic consequences, but I am sure that they do have a perspective on the multilateral order as a whole. You just mentioned the multi-perspective approach, and I am glad that we will have people on board from India, Africa, and Argentina, and they will share with us how they assess the war as what the debate is in their countries, and what is important to you personally as a co-president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Is there an observation you want to share with us, anything that you have come up with during your work? Well, according to my experience and within the UN, I am part of the UN working group of scientists that have drafted a report on the implementation of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And together with my colleagues, I noticed that we all share the perception that this is a European war. But then as well, we agree that within the UN, there is a lot of acceptance in the Global South as well on the resolution that denounces the war of aggression in Ukraine. And then I think abstentions in Central Asia could be interpreted as a positive sign. But whenever we look closer, we noticed that the African continent was quite fragmented and that many of those G20 members did not really support the resolution, at least not actively. And this different assessment of the war, when we compare it to the position of Europe and the transatlantic countries, or what we call the Western world, then this is something that we have to look into. We have to try to understand. This is something that became quite obvious when the German Chancellor traveled to Latin America. Alberto Fernandez, the Argentinian president, were right on the side of international law, whereas Lula da Silva did not really put the breach of international law in the center of attention. Why is that so? And today we will have the opportunity to listen to the voices from Argentina to India, from South Africa and the United Nations, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Imme, for this first assessment. And as always, in our foreign policy conferences, we try to involve our audience. And I tell you beforehand, you will have the possibility to raise your questions in the Q&A tool. Please make use of this opportunity. We'll try to timely answer those questions or forward them to our panelists. And as in other editions, we will raise our questions to you as well. And I do have one first question I would like to ask you. This is a follow-up question as to what's been said by Imme when the German Chancellor Scholz was visiting Brazil, and then Lula said, why not China or Brazil would not be asked to act as a mediator for Russia? And now I would like to ask the technicians to pop up our Zoom question. Many different actors try to acquire this role as a mediator. So if you were to decide who's the most appropriate person or the most appropriate country or actor to work as a mediator, we have come up with a list of different countries, organizations that have been mentioned. The United Nations, maybe Brazil or China. How about Turkey, that do play a role in the so-called serial deal, and then good old Germany, or maybe the African Union. So what do you think, who should facilitate peace talks in Eastern Europe? Now I'm really curious to see what, according to you, is the most appropriate peace mediator. Of course, this list could have been drawn up a lot longer, but we try to stick with those 7 actors. Let's see. We see that the United Nations have won the race. And this, of course, will be of the delight for our next speaker. And he might be glad to see that the second place is shared by the African Union and Turkey. Germany 6%, China and Brazil are left with 4%. So Lula's proposal with China and Brazil did not really get the acceptance, but the United Nations are supposed to make the deal. And with that, I think we can hand over directly to our first keynote speaker. And for the presentation of our keynote speaker, I will briefly change the language and switch to English.
I welcome now the permanent representative of Kenya to the United Nations, Ambassador Kimani, joining us from New York. Ambassador, it's an honor to have you with us. You gave a remarkable speech after the first UN resolution condemning Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And since that time has passed, discussions on the role of the UN went on. And you saw that, in the poll, people said if there is an ideal mediator in this conflict, the UN should play a bigger role. And so we are looking forward to your speech, Ambassador Martin Kimani. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Giorgio and Ime and all of you for inviting me. I seem to be having a lot of conversations with the German experts, and I think it says something about the relationship between our two countries. And I think it also says a lot about Germany being in listening mode, which I think is reflected in the German Africa strategy, which I think really indicated the kind of thinking and openness to shifting how we operate together that Germany is showing. But for today, I want to thank you and to note that we're close to the one-year anniversary of the illegal war in Ukraine. So if we imagine if today a pair of countries reenacted the 2nd August 1990 invasion of Kuwait, can you imagine a prompt response by a multinational coalition that is authorized by a Security Council Chapter 7 resolution? Well, I struggle to imagine that. Of course, a near copy of Resolution 768 of 1990 would be tabled by one of the members of the Council, but I think we can, with great confidence, feel that it would almost certainly be vetoed. To state the obvious, the Security Council today is unable to carry out its mandate in regard to major breaches of the UN Charter, not just by those who have vetoes in the Security Council, but by any expansionist regional power or states that want to end frustrating territorial disputes that are allied to the Permanent Five. The Ukraine war is only the latest example of our collective inability to constrain great powers from acting against the fundamental principles of the Charter. If it ends with us avoiding a major global expansion and also reinforcing the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, then there is hope for all of us. However, ladies and gentlemen, I think you will agree we appear to be headed in the opposite direction. I hope that in the course of my short remarks, you will become convinced of the urgent need for us to undertake bold reforms of our regional arrangements and of the UN. But before that, a little history. Kenya joined the UN within days of our gaining independence. The UN offered us minimal but critical protection from the superpower aggressions of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union may have been deterred from attacking each other directly, but they did not hesitate to use third countries as proxies for their militarized rivalry. They bent and broke international law and the Charter in their pursuit of global dominance. Despite this, and broadly speaking, the UN probably prevented worse excesses, including widespread territorial conquests. It committed states to rules that could be flouted, but not in the full glare of multilateral publicity. For us Africans, with our politically senseless borders, it helped us maintain peace and security by reinforcing the choice we had made to integrate rather than fight over colonial designs. In the Horn of Africa, where there was an unfortunate irredentism, it led to a series of catastrophes. So if we compare the wars in the century before the UN's formation, and then the 70 years since 1945, I think we can be deeply grateful for its existence. While the powerful and other countries have broken the Charter and international law, the extent and the frequency has certainly reduced sharply. Then the 1990s came. And again, there was a flowering of newly independent states in Europe. But now a major war has broken out, raising the level of fear among these states. Russia, as you know, justifies its invasion as a response to great power conflict. I don't agree but that is the claim Russia makes. In response, NATO is expanding, and countries far from Ukraine's killing fields, as far away as Asia, are now militarily and geopolitically fortifying themselves to confront rival powers. My friends, these are manifestations of a global order with a serious and possibly unresolvable deficit. History tells us that deterrence and military alliances have rarely maintained peace and security for a sustained period. Mostly they end with an accident or a singular act of recklessness that sparks major wars. Our historic task is therefore to pursue reforms that offer us a better chance to minimize the systemic risks from heightened great power confrontation. To minimize this risk, because we cannot totally eliminate it, we need to undertake minimal reforms. Chief among these is strengthening our regional peace and security architectures and their Chapter 8 link to the Security Council. For those of you who are not specialists on this, the Security Council's peace and security mandate also includes the work of regional organizations. Another major reform should also include changing the Security Council's membership, powers, and methods of work. Hopefully, the permanent members will embrace such changes, not for the punishment or containment of one or two members, but because they also hope to pull back from the brink. If they do not, and the present trends hold, then our collective future is grim. It may mean, if we cannot reform, that eventually countries will increasingly rely on regional arrangements and military alliances for their security, thus essentially consigning the UN to the dust heap of history. I think that many regions can learn from Africa's extensive peace and security architecture as a model, even as we Africans are advised to strengthen it. Let me finish by just saying that the world needs visionary leadership, particularly in Europe, so that we can collectively rescue the United Nations. I hope that my cry for its manifestation is heard. And once again, thank you for inviting me and listening to me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kimani. You told us that you are available to answer maybe one or two questions after your talk. Ime read it before our event and already told me that she has a question. So I would give Ime the possibility to ask a question. Ime, I hope you're on the English channel, by the way, because otherwise you have to select the English channel. Otherwise the translators get confused. And I invite all the other participants, if you have questions, to write it in the Q&A box at Zoom. But first, let's hear, Ime, your question to Ambassador Kimani.
Yes, thank you, Giorgio. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very important speech where you clearly say that it is in the interest even of the great powers or those who are greater than others to rescue the UN and its norms, and that it's the UN norms which preserve peace more effectively than military alliances. I think this is a very strong point. Now, when you think about National Security Council reform, what would you expect from the EU? What would you expect from Germany to argue for, like regarding membership? Germany has usually sided with Brazil and India in reclaiming a own permanent seat. Do you think that this is an avenue to success?
Well, you know, the debates over Security Council reform are so pitched and so long-standing. So we all sort of are in these official positions with each other. Of course, Africans believe that our continent deserves and needs to be in the Security Council. If being in the Security Council is partly about protecting those who need protection and to use the power of permanent membership to give a voice to those who need that voice, then if you look at the demographic changes in Africa, and you look at the necessity of African resources powering the transition to a renewable global economy, then you can see that there may be a lot of geopolitical risks that will increase in Africa in the coming years. And so having robust permanent membership is going to be very important. Now we have the Ezulwini consensus, and I will not go into all that, but I think Africa accepts that there will be an expansion, and that expansion may include countries such as Germany, Brazil, and India. My own personal view is that our expectations of Security Council reform should not delay us from reforming other parts of the international system, especially regional arrangements. If we are able in regions to take the norms that govern the United Nations, the norms of the Charter, and embed them deeper into our regional arrangements and make those more effective, then it could make the weakness of the Security Council for now not have such an exceptionally negative impact on the rest of the world. So since we do not have power to wield over the permanent five, I think those of us who are able to support regional arrangements, whether it's the African Union or the OSCE or CARICOM, I think it's for us now to undertake that work of analysis and reform, not against anybody, but merely so that we can mitigate and minimize the dysfunction that we now see.
Thank you, Ambassador. I don't see questions at the moment in our chat, but if you allow, I would have a question, because you mentioned the fact that a reform of the UN system means that regional organizations should be strengthened and they should work together with the UN in conflict resolution, and highlighted, for example, the importance of the African Union for conflicts in Africa. Now, in our conference, we are talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine, but there is a war in Africa, in Ethiopia, in the Tigray province, which in terms of casualties, in terms of brutality, in terms of displaced persons, is totally comparable to what is going on in Eastern Europe. And I just wonder, in a, let's say, ideal world, how could the African Union and the UN together, or the African Union alone, address this conflict and provide mediation?
Thank you, Giorgio. And I think this provides the perfect contrast. The war, the civil conflict in Ethiopia has been devastating in terms of its impact on civilians, on the state, on the economy. And certainly it did not end as soon as it should have. Too much suffering went on. So please do not take what I'm saying to be triumphalist in any way. But I did see a response by Africa. One, Ethiopia's neighbors, including Kenya, used every lever we could to work with the Ethiopian people and those who were fighting central government to start to mediate that conflict. The African Union created a process, appointed a high representative in former President Obasanjo. He was then joined by the former deputy president of South Africa and the former president of Kenya. And they were able to deliver a signed ceasefire and now a process that is being going step by step to resolve this conflict. Of course, too much blood has been spilled, too much suffering has happened. But Africa's peace and security architecture, which critically is driven by peer leadership, I think this is an illustration both of its weakness and of its great potential. If you compare where the war in Ethiopia is, which is very different from the war in Ukraine, and where Ukraine is, I think we can say that Africa has tried its best to bring that war to an end.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have time for a last question. Ime, do you have a short question? Because I don't see our participants asking questions. Before you mentioned you might have another one, or
Yeah, maybe. I'm sure you're aware of the our common agenda process and the summit of the future in 2024. What do you expect it could achieve in terms of these reforms you were mentioning, especially the regional bodies?
Thank you, Ime. Since I'm speaking to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, I must say, comment that this Zeitenwende that Germany is undertaking needs to be a global one, but not in terms of just the expenditure or the change of defense posture. But it suggests to me a fundamental attempt to rethink our geopolitical positions. And it seems to me that in this moment, if you're a responsible leadership, you will seek a Zeitenwende, because the world is changing in a dynamic and dangerous fashion. And so it seems that we first have to recommit ourselves in the summit of the future to embrace the three-legged stool that the UN rests on: the defense of human rights, the defense of our collective security through insisting on the protection of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and third, development, to ensure that inequality and poverty do not create systems of such instability that they eventually become threats to international peace and security. I think we have to rededicate ourselves. The Charter gives us the broad political and moral and ethical outlines. Now we have to infuse those with political energy. And that political energy in the summit of the future cannot be leaders coming to say things to remain as they have been, because I am sure the Chancellor of Germany will be coming to say things have changed. And the President of Kenya will come to say things have changed. How we can capture that energy in pushing for change. There's no surfeit of ideas. What there is a surfeit of political energy and commitment. So spread the Zeitenwende spirit beyond the defense establishment, and I think we can get there next year.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Kimani. Thank you for your time, and best wishes to New York. And we will now move on, and I'm calling upon my colleague, Anna Fleischer, who is joining me from Beirut. She is the office director of our Beirut office. And Anna, before we start, you will then moderate the next session. Before we start, let me just make a remark. That is that usually, as our participants saw, we always wanted, before engaging in the big discussions, have so-called messages from the ground, have some messengers from civil society telling us how the war impacted their lives. And we had actually, we were very close to have a Syrian voice. Now, she's from northern Syria. Everybody heard that there was a terrible earthquake in northern Syria and the border to Turkey. And we will not be able to have this statement. But Anna, you had the possibility to talk to that person, and maybe you can tell us a few things on what is going on with her eventually and in the region, and what her message would have been. Anna Fleischer from our Beirut office, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Giorgio. Yes, indeed, I was supposed to have a message from Syria today for you, but because of the devastating earthquake that occurred on Monday morning, that has claimed until now over 8,000 lives in Turkey and over 2,000 lives in Syria, it was not possible for Nivin Al-Hotari to speak to us. She's a women's rights activist, and she's in the north of Syria and the countryside of Aleppo, one of the hardest hit areas. It's a devastating natural disaster that is exacerbated by, particularly for the Syrian case, years of war and destruction. I spoke with her. Despite her horrible situation, she is still outside of the house. The houses are not safe, as there are many aftershocks that are coming and that are already making a situation worse for the buildings that have been damaged over the years. And it's the same for our partners in Eastern Turkey. We have Syrian partners in Eastern Turkey in the border regions that are still also outside of the house and waiting to go back. But they're not being let in yet into their homes because it's not clear whether the aftershocks will cause more damage. I just wanted to take a few moments to convey her message and to also say from our observations here, our office is located in Lebanon, but we also work on Syria and Iraq, and therefore we have a partner network with Syrians. And there was a lot of solidarity in the beginning of the war in Ukraine from Syrians, even from the war-ravaged areas in northern Syria and northwestern Syria and Idlib, because of the joint suffering caused by the Russian aggression in both contexts, even though the wars are obviously different, but there was a lot of solidarity. There's also a certain fear on behalf of Syrian civilians and activists to not be seen anymore. And now the situation of the earthquake is kind of showing this fear because there is a lack of aid coming into especially to the northwest of the country. So there's now a sort of politicization of the humanitarian crisis that we are seeing. So allow me just to read the words that Niveen has conveyed to me today before we move to the panel. As I said, Niveen Al-Hotari is a women's rights activist, and she shared these words with me. I would like to state that as a Syrian woman, I did not live through the tragedy experienced by the Ukrainian women. However, I'm fully conscious of the situation because the terrorism we face is one. With every picture I saw of women escaping to a safe place, I was seeing the reflection of myself and living for a second time my own tragedy through their eyes. I would like to say that after being subjected to injustice and violence, there is no such thing as a safe place anymore. The psychological trauma has taken and will continue to take its toll on us for years and years to come. The war that the Russians waged on our peoples had a physical, material, and moral impact. Nothing can compensate our loss, whatever the nature of this compensation may be. Our buildings have been damaged by years of bombardment by the Russian army supporting the Assad regime. They were too weak to withstand the earthquakes, and many of them collapsed. So the Russian crimes are affecting us until today in many ways. All those who suffered from injustice should unify their voices and demand fair and just accountability so that our rights should not fall behind. We will persevere in our demand for accountability. However, if we all raise our voice together, it will be much stronger. I wish that the silence on the criminal acts of Russia will not serve as a green light for them to inflict their terror on other populations, because the silence of the international community against their terror in Syria encouraged them to inflict the same terror on another country. These were the words by Niveen that she shared with me today.
Thank you very much, Anna. And before you introduce your panelists and start the discussion, I just would like to remind all our participants that we have this wonderful Q&A tool, the box at the bottom of your screen, where you can write down questions, and we will then try to pass on some of these questions to our panelists. And now I think Anna, over to you, and you can introduce your panelists, and I will switch off my camera.
Thank you, Giorgio. Yes, I would like to move to the panel, our distinguished panel that we have with 3 speakers that will address the global implications and perspectives of the war in Eastern Europe. I would like to start with Ambassador Lila Roldan Vázquez. She's the Director of Eurasian Studies and a member of the Executive Board of the Argentine Council for Foreign Relations. Ambassador Vázquez served in the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Undersecretary for Latin American Affairs, Director General for Foreign Policy, and among other postings, and most importantly for our discussion today, she served as Ambassador to Ukraine from 2007 until 2015. Ambassador Vázquez, the floor is yours for your 5-minute intervention.
Thank you, Anna, very much. And thank you, the Foundation, for inviting me. It's a great honor to me to be sharing these few ideas with you. In a few days, on February the 24th, we will have this anniversary of the full invasion of Russia into Ukraine, which is not really the beginning of the war. The war began in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the Russian support to some activists in the region, of course, incited by Russia, in the Donbass. This full-fledged war thrown by Russia on Ukraine has marked 2020 in many ways. First, it has consolidated the Western alliance in their effort to sustain Ukraine's fight for independence and territorial integrity. It has changed the scenery of the world in a very, very meaningful and possibly permanent way. It has shown also a significant decline in the effectiveness of international organizations and multilateralism in general, which we have just heard from Ambassador Kimani. And it is taking thousands of human lives, soldiers on both sides, civilians on Ukrainian soil. But it also reflects a broader conflict between Russia and the West, between liberalism and illiberalism, between liberal democracies and autocracies, in the context of the world undergoing very structural changes. And in this framework, Western and industrialized countries have reacted promptly to condemn the invasion and apply sanctions to the Russian Federation. But in other areas of the world, however, reactions have been diverse. The global South has not taken sides in a definite nor concerted way for or against Russia. While effects of the war are being felt everywhere in the world, practically in every region, the Latin American and the Caribbean region is not an exception to this. Most countries share with Russia and Ukraine a condition of agricultural producers and exporters. And while this could be seen as an advantage because of the suspension of exports from Russia and Ukraine, in fact, it's not so, because these two countries are also main exporters of fertilizers to the region, which are a substantial ingredient in agricultural production. And the scarcity of agricultural fertilizers and decline in agricultural productivity will surely affect our economies and may produce social movements of protest, social instability, when in countries that have already fragile economies, and which could seriously affect foreign investment perspectives in the region. Regarding the reactions to the war, there is a considerable disparity among ideologies in the region, in the governments of the region, and this affects the possibility to agree on concerted actions or positions. The situation was clearly reflected not only on leaders' declarations, public declarations, but also in the UN, where most of the countries condemned Russian invasion, while others abstained, or if very few voted against. And this could be also a part of another foreseeable consequence of Russia's war on Ukraine, which is the return to big powers' spheres of influence. And it could eventually affect the non-alignment policy the region has traditionally maintained. The Organization of American States, the OAS, has also adopted resolutions on the war, condemning Russia, even the first day of the invasion, and then claiming for respect for human rights and immediate cessation of hostilities, and finally suspending the Russian Federation as a permanent observer to the organization. And on the other hand, we are witnessing reactions from great powers competing for a stronger presence in the region, such as the Biden administration reaching out to Maduro government for oil supply, or Russia signing defense cooperation agreements with Nicaragua and Venezuela, or China's positioning itself as a strategic economic partner. Nevertheless, no specific actions or cooperation schemes seem sufficient to predict that some countries will definitely decide to integrate the so-called sphere of influence of the Russian Federation, which will probably continue seeking to intensify political relations and cooperation projects in the region, but its economy will surely suffer from the large number and scope of the sanctions, and this could limit its efforts towards countries that don't belong to its immediate area of influence, nor are strategic, economic, or defense partners.
Mm-hmm.
Given today's decline of unipolarity and even bipolarity in this new world scene with various leading actors, states can choose between different alternatives or poles of attraction. So this is an opportunity for the US and the EU to upgrade their relations and investments in Latin American region as a way to protect shared Western values and enhance cooperation on subjects of common interest, such as international peace, food security, and environment.
Great.
Let's
Maybe we can, yes.
Yes, I'm finishing.
Okay, all right.
Let's conclude the EU-Mercosur agreement as well as other agreements in the region, and let's put them in motion as soon as possible, because we need to work on concerted actions to stop this global security risk that Putin's reckless actions have begun.
Mm-hmm.
And Latin America is a peace zone, a nuclear-free zone, weapons zone, which could and should help in these efforts. And finally, we also cherish the territorial integrity principle, cruelly violated by Russia, and so important for Argentina in its permanent claim to sovereignty to the Malvinas Islands, in which the region supported us traditionally. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to hear what they have to say, my distinguished panelist colleagues.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Vasquez, for your words. And for sure, we will come back to you with a few questions after. So thank you so much for your intervention. I would now like to move to Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. She is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, with over 2 decades of experience in the field of politics and international relations. And her expertise lies specifically in South Africa's foreign policy, South-South cooperation, and the role of emerging powers in Africa. I welcome you, and I will also give the floor to you now for your intervention.
Great, thanks, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening. It's great to be part of the conversation, and I think my remarks will probably echo some of the points that Ambassador Vasquez has highlighted, as well as the points that Ambassador Kimani has made. I thought I would start really by sort of putting out what South Africa's position has been. It's been a position that certainly in the global north has been quite, it has, I think, puzzled some people. It has been in other quarters quite controversial. And then I think also just reflect a little bit on the issues of the UN Charter and issues of territorial integrity. For South Africa, and I think for a number of countries in the global south, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is really seen as a proxy war between the West, NATO, and Russia. And certainly at government level, a very strong sense that NATO's actions in the aftermath of the Cold War, in other words, its eastward expansion, are really a prime cause of the situation that we now see. That because it didn't respect the legitimate security concerns of Russia, and Ukraine was really taking it all the way up to the Russian frontier. Now we can argue about that, but that certainly is a very strong element of the way in which the war is perceived among certain circles, both in South Africa, but I think in other countries of the global South. It's a European war. It's seen as a European war with global consequences, and the West. And there's also a perception, and certainly in the South African case, one that has been very strongly articulated by the government, that the West has tried to bully us into supporting them when it's not necessarily in the interests of the global South to pick sides. And I think the issue of non-alignment, which the ambassador also referred to, I think is an important dimension here as well. And coupled with that, the fact that when the global South, developing countries, put items on the global agenda, the response is not necessarily as urgent as the response has been in the case of the Ukraine war. Clearly, the impact has been significant. I think we've already heard about food insecurity, about fuel rises, about rising inflation globally. It's highlighted the inadequacy of the UN Security Council, something which I think countries like South Africa and others in the global South don't see as a positive, but hopefully see as a way of mobilizing and galvanizing, I think very much in the way in which Ambassador Kimani articulated, really galvanizing reform of the system. I do believe that reforming the UN Security Council by just looking at membership is not going to necessarily solve the problem. I don't think that having a bigger membership in February last year would necessarily have moved beyond the impasse that we saw. But as Ambassador Kimani said, it is important to actually really seriously, boldly, bravely, really tackle the issue of reform of the UN system more broadly. There is another dimension which I think is important to articulate here, which has been very strongly made by a number of many countries in the global South, and that is that there has been a significant reaction, understandably, to what happened in Ukraine, and this was definitely an invasion, and this was definitely a violation of the UN Charter and territorial integrity. But clearly, in many instances over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, there have also been cases where the West itself, or key countries within the West, let's put it that way, have themselves not upheld the UN Charter. And while this is, we shouldn't engage in whataboutism, what about Iraq? What about Libya? This clearly plays into the perspectives that many in the global South have about the way in which the West has responded specifically to the war in Ukraine. What it has also led to is a resurgence in the desire to re-energize the non-aligned or non-alignment. I think, however, that the point that Ambassador Kimani made about the Zeitenwende, or the Zeitenwende, I think is the way is pronounced. Correct me here also, Anna, if I'm in my pronunciation. But that does require all, I think, countries in the world, including in the developing world, to really rethink and reappraise themselves of their foreign policy positions. The way in which we saw the world as South Africa when we committed apartheid to the ash heap of history in 1994 is a very different world from the world we see today. And what I think many of us should be focusing on in the global South is not to highlight only the double standard and say, well, we're not going to come out strongly and condemn Russia because America has done the same in Iraq. And not to look at country alliances, but let's focus on principal alliances. And certainly all developing countries that are not great powers have an interest in ensuring that the principles of the UN Charter are adhered to, because The great powers usually can do what they like, and they can get away with it. We can't, and we don't, because the UN system was about moving beyond might is right into a system where we're all respecting international law. We recognize that not everybody will respect international law, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't call out everybody who doesn't respect international law. And so I'm probably running out of time. I have a couple of points to make on food security and climate change, but I'm happy to take those afterwards in your follow-up questions.
All right, food security. We'll put a pin in it. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I would like now to move to a third continent and a third region, and introduce our third speaker, Gaurav Sharma, who is currently on a sabbatical leave from his role as an advisor on artificial intelligence from the German Development Corporation, GIZ, in India. He is also a Task Force 5 member of the Think 20 initiative of the G20. He was previously, and he holds a master's in international and European security from Geneva, a postgraduate diploma in international human rights law, humanitarian laws, and refugee laws. I now give the floor to you for your 5-minute intervention, Gaurav.
Thank you so much, Anna. I think I'm loud and clear. I think I would start my statement with solidarity for the earthquake victims. I think that is something which brings us together in unison. And I think my take on India's mandate or something is to revolve around the G20 as our single statement. We like one earth, one family, one future. So predominantly, if you take India, has been consistently calling for an immediate cessation of the hostilities. And I'm not trying to say, how this is put up, but it is basically that we want diplomatic efforts and dialogue to end the conflict. I mean, everybody wants to end the conflict. I mean, in the end, I think there is no two ways about it. I would like to take that how the trajectory of this confusion has actually seen from the time it started and how it leverages now. But India's position is also vis-a-vis the its own post-Cold War and pre-Cold War perceptions of the West and its own conflicts that it has actually seen in the last 50 years with 3 wars with Pakistan and 1 war with China, and the reactions of the West, I think has been modulated very well by Dr. Elizabeth regarding the perceptions of the global South. But there is also something that is very simple. Our Prime Minister has said and communicated directly to both President Putin and Ukrainian President that the era is not of the war. So they have spoken on the phone, and this is very simple, and there needs to be dialogue. But what I'm coming to is that our own perceptions have been laid out in history, and realpolitik currently is not as it was in even before pre-1991. So India became a liberalized, open-up economy in 1991, and also the fall of the Berlin Wall took care of its, the shift of dilemmas. But paradoxically, what has happened, the war in Ukraine, at least in the Indian sentiment, has diminished the trust in the Western sort of powers and concentrated people's minds on how to hedge their bets for their own sovereign national interests. And I think the policy that we are trying, I'm not the voice of the government, and I'm not the voice of civil society, but I think as an analyst, what we see is that there is a multipolar world evolved, both in terms of economic superpowers coming to light, China, India, middle powers gaining momentum, and the geopolitics is now becoming more transactional politics, because the interconnected nature of trade and commerce has left more in every country to look after for himself. So, the question of food supplies was there. We just became independent in our food supply chains 20 years past. And even in this conflict, it showed that one knee-jerk reaction can actually dismantle the whole supply chains globally. I think the second question of where India is being looked upon is to have its own first foreign policy mandate, what India believes is right. And I think we have never been in a sense of allyship towards the West or towards the East. And we are in a nuclear triad with Pakistan and China. We are the most, sensitive zones where conflicts have evolved. But it is also the simple words from a point of view is how we define conflict is not through the Ukrainian war lens. The definition of conflict and definition of war, if it is proxy war for us, it has been last 50 years with terrorism. If it is in the East with South China Sea taking care, annexation of islands, it is also an act of war. If there was nobody on that island, does not mean that it is not an act of war. So I think this paradoxical, way of how Europe thinks is not Europe's and West's problem, and what Europe thinks is not East's problem or cannot be overcome overnight into a global problem mandate, is not what India is thinking at. I would still reflect on 2 or 3 contentious items. I think that is, and I know people will ask questions. One is the arms, sort of mandate, India's defense ties, right? It has predominantly been Russian. We are still 60 to 70% dependent on it. There are no two things about it. But India has diversification process, and arms diversification, as anybody would say, or even indigenization, takes decades. So it will take us at least 2 more decades to really become sort of disjoint and become like, I would say, become like China to come with. The second point I would say is the nuclear ties. India's nuclear ties have actually been advocated based on our sanctions from 1974 when we had the peaceful sort of explosion. I mean, there, and then the second sanctions when we did the second nuclear test, right? And that in 90s had our sanctions. So basically, our support partners in that era were always Russia or Soviet Union from 60s, 70s, 80s, and then Russia. So there, and this expansion is also diversified after the civil nuclear agreement with the United States, and the and now we are doing, and I'm talking about only civil nuclear agreements, construction of nuclear power plants, supply of nuclear fuels. So there is this engagement which is continuing. And again, if you see the time frame of building a nuclear power plant, running it, sanctioning it, everything, it takes. So it's not like we can decouple overnight with our sense of sort of engagement. And the oil imports, are very, I think, one of the key topics where people are, I don't know, they get red faces very quickly. And I would like to say this very contextually, that even if EU and US did the sanctions, it was not until December and even January this year. And if you just see the oil map, it's very, and we have gained absolutely substantial sort of imports. But EU is still the biggest importer of fossil fuels. And even what India takes through as crude oil and refines it, it still gets back to United States with byproducts. Okay, so I think this global supply chains cannot be dismantled and saying, oh, we have put sanctions, we can just, and everybody's diversifying, right, in its own cells. But the whole idea is that, the lens of the war is not through one light, it is a prism. And you have to see those 7 shades of light which are going through. At least in the last 3-4 months, you would see the change of stance of India being more direct, more compelling, more outward in the United Nations Security Council. Our at least presidency was in December, and you could see the statements by our representative. But it is not that we, the world can be just taken off and taken into this. There is a sense of multipolar world which is evolving, and we have a bigger threat with China as our borders and a biggest land border conflict with them. And still, they are the biggest trade partners, and we have the biggest trade deficit with them. So it's not that if there is something that we can decouple from China tomorrow, it can't, right? So I think I would rest my sort of 3 or 4 points there.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gauda, for your questions, for your intervention. I'm sorry. It seems that we are running out of time, and this is really really unfortunate. However, I wanted to give you space to really have your interventions. I thank you so much for your words, and I wish we would have had more time, but we are on a very tight schedule and we have to go to the next speaker. I really apologize, but your interventions are highly valued, and I think it's important to realize that we do live in a multipolar world that reflects a reality that is different in 2023 than bipolar world that it seems that we have slipped back into in the past year. So thank you so much for your interventions, and apologies that we don't have a lot of space for Q&A. I will now have to move to our fourth intervention for today by Ivan Kuchc, who is a researcher at the International Center for Defense and Security. Ivan researches Russia's foreign and domestic politics. Currently, he is focusing on Russia's wartime diplomacy with the countries of the global south. Ivan, I will also give you the floor for 5 minutes. And then if you stick to time, we'll be able to take some questions. Thank you.
Certainly. I hope you can hear me fine. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I want to just preface my short intervention by mentioning that recently Estonia released a new updated version of its national security strategy, where Russia and its war of aggression against Ukraine is highlighted as the foremost threat for the national security of Estonia. And I know that this perception of Russia as a threat is shared by Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Poland, and other countries in the proximity of Russia. So this is why there's sometimes incredulity among these countries and in the West, why there has been a divergence between the ways the West and the global South have responded to Russia's war of aggression. So this is a very complex question, but as a researcher of Russia, I want to offer a couple of thoughts about this question, focusing on Russia specifically and its relationship with the global South, hopefully not making too crass generalizations. So I will start with the conclusions. First, despite its limitations, Russia remains a capable power and is deeply invested in maintaining a global presence. Second, not alienating Russia can be a matter of national security for the countries of the global South. Much of the incredulity in the West hinges on the idea that Russia has little to offer to the global South. Russia's economy is large, but insufficient to deliver aid, investment, trade at the same scale as the West or China. Russia's high-tech sector has strengths, but generally cannot compete with that of cannot compete on a global level. Its internal market is small when compared to those of the European Union or the United States. Nevertheless, Russia's leadership is aware of these limitations, so its offer to the global South has focused on certain niches. These were already mentioned: grains, fertilizers, investments in energy and space, and security services, including arms, the trade of arms. Russia's offer is generally taken to the fullest, the whole span of offer, let's say, by regimes shunned by the international community, such as the Bashar al-Assad dictatorship in Syria or the Nicolás Maduro regime in Venezuela. But many countries also draw from this Russian offer. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat, and also one of the largest exporters of fertilizers, often delivering these two products to some of the world's poorest states. Its arms exports also reach to many Western partners. Now, many of these exchanges have continued since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine. Because of this, some have characterized the global South response as neutrality, and I would characterize this position more as security seeking. With this in mind, Russia's offer to the global South targets specific sectors which the global South countries may become dependent on, such as the large number of countries that are dependent on wheat imports from Russia or fertilizers. And due to the sensitivity of these two products, for the poorest countries, it is not an option to alienate Russia. But there's another way that national security is relevant in the way that many countries of the global South have responded to the full-scale invasion. And for this, we need to consider the Wagner military company. This is a state-aligned military company, and it is a product of our globalized era. Nevertheless, its role in Russia's foreign policy resembles more that of the Cold War. Moscow's quest to be a great power has led it to patronize authoritarian regimes that deploy extreme violence against the populations to remain in power. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, Wagner has become one of the deadliest armed forces of the conflicts in Mali and the Central African Republic, proceeding in both of them with a lack of accountability and regard for human rights. The implications of these and other Wagner deployments are stark. The prospect of Russian armed support can encourage the rise of new illegitimate governments, as they can sometimes pitch themselves to try and receive Russian support to stay in power. The deployment of Wagner can render the consequences of this support into disasters for their societies. To conclude, the Global South has generally opted not to alienate Russia because Russia still has something to offer to them, and because alienating Russia can pose risks to the national security of these countries. The divergence between West and the Global South on Russia's war does not need to widen as time goes on. Mutual understanding between North and South can help prevent this divergence from growing. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for your intervention. If you allow me one question before I hand back over to my colleague, you spoke about the non-alignment of the Global South for you being more of a security consideration. So this is also a question that came up for me during the interventions of our three other panelists is a non-alignment a position that then may later come back to haunt those regions, because who knows who else is next on the list of countries. I mean, there's obviously different logics, but speaking from the Syrian experience and from what we have been observing with the Russian intervention in Syria, we know that there's a long breadth of military intervention by the Russian army and by the Russian regime. So do you view this as a strategically sound move? Are you seeing it more of a trying to align yourself in a increasingly, as I said, almost bipolar seeming world again? Could you say a few words on that, please?
Certainly, and I also see the looming contradictions, let's say, that can lurk behind this strategy. But I think here the issue remains the UN and its ability to provide a framework that guarantees the security of every country in the world against the creation of spheres of influence, of foreign intervention. In this sense, I think and this is a perception that in fact not only is shared, but not only, as we have heard, is perceived in the Global South, but it's something that Ukraine itself has, its diplomats, its people have highlighted, that the UN would have to be would be a better vehicle for a collective security for every country in the world, perhaps better than so-called taking sides or taking this pragmatic approach or any other approach. It would be better a common investment on the UN.
Thank you so much. I have two very short questions to Mr. Sharma and Elizabeth. The first one for Gaurav: how do you see the nuclear threat or threats from the Russians from the point of view of a state that sees itself as a nuclear power? Does it harden the structures of the war, or could it even end the war? If I can just ask you for a short statement, so then we don't go too long.
No, that is that's a make or break. I mean, I think that is a question which everybody is asking. I think it is always 0.00001% absolutely not happening. But then that will be the end of the world conversations. That will be the end of all conversations. Nuclear is not an option at all. Not at all.
Mm. Thank you for those clear, very, very clear words. And then to Elizabeth, there was a question from the audience. How do you view the joint naval drills that South Africa, Russia, and China plan to conduct on the 17th of February, 2023?
Yes, so that has also garnered a lot of attention. South Africa's official position has been that, you know, we conduct naval exercises with any number of Western countries as well. China and Russia are our BRICS partners, and you know, one should not read too much into this. They're doing, I think, they're doing search and rescue and humanitarian anti-piracy drills. Although there's also been a statement that Russia may test one of its new hypersonic missiles, which I don't know, and that raises a whole bunch of other questions. I think just looking at it in the context of what has happened over the last year, and notwithstanding the fact that Russia is a member of the BRICS, I would have thought that this was probably not the right time to conduct naval exercises. I think this has been a blatant, and in fact, our foreign ministry on the 24th of February did say as much, calling for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. And at various times they've said, you know, that this has been a violation of the UN Charter. But there have also been a number of things that our Department of Defense has proceeded with, which would sort of place our, you know, place the way in which we articulate our position on the war and sort of in a different light. But yes, I you know, if I was Minister of Defense, I would have postponed the naval exercises. I think they come across as very insensitive and not actually really looking at it as one should look at the situation.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Vasquez, there wasn't a direct question to you, but if you would like to comment briefly on anything, I just want to give you the opportunity.
Thank you, Anna. Not just that listening to my colleagues, it's obvious that the global South is not a unity. It's there are so different regions and interests because, as Gaurav said, they are neighbors of China. They have many difficulties with China. Africa has its own problems of security and food security that leads them to depend heavily on food exporters like Russia, and they cannot give themselves the luxury of saying we cut our links to Russia because of the war. And of course, Latin America is much further away. It's very, very, very far from the center of the conflict. And it's, of course, less touched by the consequences. Only the economic consequences maybe, but not such as other regions in the global South. So I think we shouldn't lose this perspective that there are not masses of countries that are going to react in one way or the other, and the Western countries should pay more attention maybe to strategic planning and strategic policy making, foreign policy making, not thinking only of wars or security, but the whole international relationship for really have a future of peace.
Very well put. Very well put. I think this is a very, very valuable ending statement for this panel. I thank you all, to all of the different regions of the world. Stay safe and healthy in these times. And with this, I hand the word back over to my colleague, Giorgio. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Und ich werde die letzte Viertelstunde mit Ihnen in Deutsch.
And the remaining 15 minutes will be spent and facilitated in German language. And before I talk to our Minister of State, Katja Köll from the Green Party, I would like to look into your opinions here in the audience. We have heard quite a few perspectives from the global South on the war in Ukraine, and I would like to reflect on that with you with the help of a short poll. And the question number 4 is has reference to an article that Ivan Kusch wrote about the seeming neutrality of the South, and that is something where we decide quite decisively and aggressor and affected. Is it okay to be neutral, or do you have to take a side? So your options is yes, it is all right to stay neutral, or no, you have to take a side. You have to decide for either side. Let's see what you respond. We've seen that many countries in the global South prefer neutrality with very good reason to do so. There might be economic reasons or political or ideological ones. Let's see what you responded. Okay, we can see that 2/3 think you should decide for either side. You have to be true to one of the sides, whereas 1/3, a bit more than 1/3, says yes, it is okay to stay neutral. And then we have prepared a second question, or a fifth one. Could you please display it? Okay, so it's quite an easy one.
Den russischen Aggressionskrieg natürlich die Prinzipien der UN in Frage.
Through the war of aggression, the principles of the UN have been put under scrutiny, but the UN is like a box drill that's been hit once and again, but never really goes down. So do you think the UN is compromised? Yes or no? No would be no. It is not because it has a certain resilience and is familiar and knows how to deal with difficult, bigger powers. So what's your opinion? Is the UN compromised, yes or no? Majority, 2/3 majority says yes, the UN is compromised, and 1/3 at least still thinks that there is hope that the UN remains to be operative. And then there's a third question. I would like to get you involved on a question that was mentioned by Ambassador Kimani. We've seen that the UN is not at its height, and we have received several calls to reform the institution. So please display our third question that reads as follows: how and why the UN should be or could be reformed. So we have a few, there are a few hiccups. The UN, as I said, is in a state of a crisis, a permanent crisis, but it is still in place. It is still the reference, the benchmark for international law, and there are different proposals as to how we can reform the UN. And I'm hopeful to see the poll displayed now on our screens. Let's see if we can visualize it. Just a sec. Thank you. So in order to save the UN system, what would be your first priority?
The reform of the Security Council, or a dialogue between the big powers, the great powers, or a better North-South dialogue, or should we rather address inequalities and double standards? And should we rather try to overcome these? Here again, I am quite interested in your answers. And the reform of the Security Council seems to be favored by most people. We heard Ambassador Kimani about that issue today. Then, second, people said we need to address inequalities and double standards. And then, thirdly, people said we need a better North-South dialogue, and the dialogue between the great powers seems to be favored least. That already shows us what your assessment is, and now I am very happy to introduce Minister of State Katja Coyle. We are going to have our concluding talk. Minister Coyle, would you kindly turn on your camera and your microphone? We are about to start our conversation. Katja, can you turn on your camera as well so we can see you? Ah, yeah, there she is.
Ich sehe jetzt Katja Keul.
I can see Katja Keul now.
Wackelig. Kannst du mich hören, Katja?
Can you hear me, Katja? The line doesn't seem to be too good.
Staatsministerin
Katja Keul is Minister of State in the German Foreign Office. Can we ask her again? Can we see and hear her? But we seem to be having a technical problem.
So. Katja, du hast dich gerade bewegt.
Katja, I could somehow feel you've been moving.
Vielleicht können wir in der Zeit kurz mal den Namen auch von Katja Keul verbessern. Sehr gut, das hat schon geklappt.
All right, there seems to be something working now. I will try again to introduce the Minister of State Katja Keul, working at the Foreign Office in Berlin.
Das ist jetzt natürlich bitter, weil wir hatten
it's so unfortunate. We had our rehearsal before we started this conference and everything worked out nicely, but at the moment we seem to be having some technical problems.
Ja, wir hatten dich jetzt kurz gehört, Katja.
We could briefly, very briefly hear you. Are you with us?
Genau, die Technik schreibt gerade, Katja, vielleicht kannst
Technicians
du ausschalten, wenn die
just told me maybe the Minister of State should turn off her camera because that usually increases the bandwidth for sound so that we can at least hear you.
Das ist jetzt natürlich ein bisschen bitter.
It was really very unfortunate not to be able to connect.
Also,
All
ich
right.
glaube, Katja Keul.
It seems not possible to connect to Katja Keul, Minister of State at the Foreign Office, and
Das sieht gut aus.
Ich kann jemanden sehen.
Das ist gut.
Ja.
well, there we are.
Katja, wir können dich sehen.
Katja, we can now see you.
Schön, dass du da bist. Du kannst mich sehen.
It's wonderful to have you. You can see me, you can hear me. All right.
Die erste Frage, die ich...
My first question would be about a longer conversation that we had right now. We said that in the global south, people have different opinions about the war in Ukraine compared to our opinion here in Europe. You've just been to Africa, you traveled a number of countries, and I read somewhere that you have also heard the same. You said that whenever I address the war in Ukraine, I noticed a difference in the way African countries talk about that. Can you share your impressions? Who did you meet? Who did you talk to? What were the arguments you heard? Well, indeed, I traveled to African countries a lot in the first year. It was important for me also to tell our African partners, we are not going to use this war in Europe as a pretext to turn our back on Africa. Quite the opposite. This war shows that we all need to defend our values together. So that was an important message I brought, and I had talks to about 10 countries. Only 2 of them voted like we voted in the General Assembly. Most presidents and ministers I talked to belonged to the group of those that had abstained from a vote in the General Assembly. The responses predominantly showed that there is a consensus. Borders must not be violated. That was the topic that I highlighted most of all. And I said, especially for African countries, it always was important to have the integrity of their borders respected. And so, of course, that was something that all African partners agreed to. And of course, they understood that violation of borders is something that is not fair and just, but they didn't want to take a position because they don't see this war as a war between Russia and Ukraine. They see this war as a proxy war, and they said, you'd better get together and solve your conflicts. And so what they usually say is, why don't you negotiate? And this is when I always said, we do not prevent negotiations from happening, but we have a partner that took the decision not to negotiate, but use military force. And so there were different opinions during these talks. We always heard from our partners that, of course, there were very close relations between the former Soviet Union to African countries, in particular in the south of Africa. And that is why they have a traditional tie to Russia, and that is why they don't want to take sides. The word neutrality wasn't so often, but it was clear that, you know, you've got a problem over there. You do sit down and try to find a solution. We do have our conflicts at home as well. And we would have expected the African countries to mention the war in Iraq very often as one of the examples of double standards. No, they didn't do that, but they said the conflict in the West Sahara region is typical for the double standards. And that conflict is much more important for the African states compared to what we consider important when it comes to showing our credibility vis-a-vis Africa. So there were a number of controversial opinions, but nobody really took the complete Russian narrative and said that this war was a just war. This was a narrative I never encountered. The partners in Africa had their own African narrative when talking to me.
Wir haben dich leider wieder verloren.
Unfortunately, we lost you once again, Katja. But I think we got a very good impression about the talks you had in Africa.
Auch für unsere Position haben, denn die Werte in der
Wunderbar. Katja, vielen Dank.
Katja, thank you very much. We had a technical glitch. We had a technical hiccup. Couldn't hear you for a moment, but 90% of your message was clear. If you are still with us, then I would have a very last question to you. And maybe you indeed turn off your camera because we have a very poor connection and usually we need all the bandwidth for sound. During our session, we talked about a very important topic for you. We talked about the United Nations, the UN Charter and international law. 2/3 of our participants in the conference say that after this attack, the United Nations have been compromised. We have one permanent member of the UN Security Council that is the aggressor, and China backs Russia. What is your opinion? Are the United Nations currently compromised, or is the UN still capable to take action? and what can be done in order to strengthen the principles of the United Nations. But I can only give you 1 minute to answer that big question. The UN Security Council as a central body of the UN, of course, is not functional because one permanent member has committed a violation of law. That's a problem, but still we need to strengthen the United Nations. We have no other organization. After 2 world wars, we were able to set up structures, and we should not throw them overboard, because that will leave us with nothing at all. We cannot recreate it once we give it up. And so my appeal is to keep it up. It was said by Ambassador Kimani, we need to find ways and means to strengthen international law, also in other places like the regional organizations. And here the European Union is an important partner. But of course, violations of the law do not weaken the law. They weaken the way in which we respond. And we need to get together again as an international community to condemn this war of aggression and take common measures. Minister of State Katja Coyle, thank you very much for your statement. And that closes our online session for today. It was the 3rd session of our 23rd Foreign Policy Conference, and this ends the online parts, the Zoom part of our conference. Thank you for being with us, and please bear with us. We had a few technical problems at the end. We are going to have a closing event on Friday. It will be a face-to-face meeting at the Böll Foundation. We are going to have Mr. Popescu, the Moldovan Minister of Foreign Affairs, former NATO Secretary General, Mr. Rasmussen, our Foreign Minister, Ms. Baerbock, is going to talk, and we are also going to have some permanent international experts. We have a lot of registrations, but if you come early in the morning, you will find an opportunity to join us for this conference. That was all for today. In the chat, you can see now an evaluation sheet. So if you have a minute, please do give us your feedback. What did you like about this conference? And hopefully you're not going to criticize us for the small technical problems too much. I would like to say thanks to my team, the team I worked with, Milena Grünewald from the Desk of Foreign and Security Policy, Corinna Fischer from Global Diplomacy Lab, our partner, our project manager, Carolina Bertram, and our intern, Daria Yeremechuk. And you can now turn on your camera to dear team members and say goodbye to everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.